The grinding sound of coral against steel cut through the morning air like fingernails on a chalkboard. Our landing craft lurched to a violent stop, throwing us forward against each other in a tangle of rifles, packs, and cursing Marines. For a heartbeat, everything was silent except for the waves lapping against the hull. Then the machine guns opened up. The first burst shredded the air inches above our heads, sending splinters of wood flying from the boat sides. I pressed my face into the hot metal deck, tasting salt and fear as bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. Around me, 23 other Marines hugged whatever cover they could find in that cramped space, their eyes wide with sudden realization that this wasn't going to be the easy fight we'd been promised. Over the side. "Move it! Move it!" Sergeant Martinez was screaming, but his voice sounded distant and hollow over the ringing in my ears from the gunfire. I forced myself to look up, past the chaos of helmets and equipment, toward the beach that was supposed to be ours by noon. What I saw made my blood run cold. The pristine white sand we'd studied in photographs was gone, replaced by a moonscape of shell craters and twisted metal. Smoke hung over everything like a dirty blanket, and Throt had haze. Muzzle flashes winked at us from positions that weren't supposed to exist. The intelligence boys had told us the pre-invasion bombardment would level everything. They'd told us the Japanese garrison was demoralized and ready to surrender. They'd told us a lot of things. They'd been dead wrong. My name is Frank Morrison, and I was a 19-year-old rifleman with the 1st Marine Division when we hit the beaches of Peleliu on September 15, 1944. What we thought would be a quick 3-day operation to secure an airfield turned into something else entirely, a nightmare that would haunt those of us who survived for the rest of our lives. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it really was from the beginning. 3 days before the landing, we'd been aboard the transport ship USS Monrovia, steaming through waters so blue they looked fake. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the wakes of our massive invasion fleet. I'd never seen so many ships in one place: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, all of them loaded with Marines and ammunition and the promise of victory. The mood on deck was almost festive. Guys were writing letters home, cleaning their rifles, playing cards, and cracking jokes about how we'd be back in time for Christmas. The brass had briefed us that Peleliu was going to be a cakewalk compared to Saipan and Guam, where we'd taken heavy casualties just 2 months before. "Look at this," said Tommy Kowalski, my best friend since boot camp, spreading out an aerial photograph on his bunk. "The whole island's only 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. We'll have this place wrapped up in 72 hours, mark my words." I studied the black and white image with him. Peleliu looked like a pork chop from the air, with dense jungle covering most of the interior, and that crucial airfield running down the southern portion like a concrete backbone. The northern end was dominated by something called the Brogal Ridge, a series of coral hills that didn't look like much in the photograph. "See those ridges?" I pointed to the white lines cutting through the jungle. "Wonder what's up there." "Nothing but monkeys and parrots," Tommy laughed, folding up the photo. "The Navy's been pounding this rock for 3 straight days. Anything that was alive up there is fish food by now." I wanted to believe him. We all did. After the brutal fighting we'd seen in the Central Pacific, the idea of an easy victory was like water in the desert. But something about those ridges bothered me, the way they seemed to dominate the entire island, watching over everything below. The night before the landing, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my kid brother Billy back home in Ohio, probably getting ready for his senior year of high school. I'd promised Mom I'd look after myself, that I'd come home in one piece to help run the family hardware store. Lying in that swaying bunk, surrounded by the snores and quiet conversations of my fellow Marines, I tried to picture myself behind the counter again, selling nails and paint to neighbors who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. But those ridges kept creeping back into my thoughts. At 0530 hours on September 15th, we were roused by the ship's general alarm. The pre-landing bombardment had begun, and even 20 miles offshore we could feel the Monrovia shudder with each salvo from the battleships. I climbed up on deck to watch, and what I saw took my breath away. The horizon was lit up like the 4th of July. Flashes erupted along the line of warships as their big guns hurled shells toward Peleliu. 16-inch projectiles from the battleships Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Mississippi screamed overhead like freight trains, each one carrying enough explosive to level a city block. Cruisers added their voices to the symphony of destruction, and diving bombers peeled off from their carriers to add their payloads to the inferno. Whispered Martinez, standing beside me at the rail. There won't be nothing left but gravel when we get there. For 3 hours, the bombardment continued without pause. The smoke rising from Peleliu grew thicker and blacker, until the entire island disappeared beneath a dark cloud. When the guns finally fell silent, my ears were ringing, and I was deaf to anything but shouting. Load 'em up. The order passed from ship to ship, and we began the familiar ritual of preparing for an amphibious assault. We checked our gear one final time: our rifle, ammunition, first aid kit, rations, water. I had 120 rounds for my M1 Garand and a couple of hand grenades, plus my bayonet and entrenching tool. Not much to bet your life on, but it would have to do. The landing craft were lowered into the water with much cursing and mechanical groaning. We climbed down the cargo nets, trying not to look at the waves churning below. One slip, and you'd be crushed between the boat and the ship shoal. I'd seen it happen before. Our boat held 24 Marines from K Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment. I knew most of their faces by now. We'd trained together, fought together, bled together. There was Martinez, our squad leader, a tough Mexican kid from El Paso who'd been fighting since Guadalcanal. Tommy Kowalski, the Joker from Pittsburgh who could make you laugh even when the world was ending. Bobby Chen, a quiet Chinese American from San Francisco who was the best shot in the company. Big Jim Murphy from Boston, who could carry twice the gear of any other man and still keep pace on a 30-mile march. We were the best infantry in the world, and we knew it. We'd proven ourselves on beach after beach across the Pacific. But as our landing craft circled in the assembly area, waiting for the signal to begin our final approach, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The smoke over Peleliu wasn't dissipating. If anything, it was getting thicker. "Coxswain," Martinez called to the Navy man steering our boat. "How long till we hit the beach?" 20 minutes, Sarge. Maybe less. 20 minutes. I tried to imagine what we'd find when we got there. The intelligence briefings had shown us neat little positions marked on maps, with precise fields of fire and carefully calculated approach routes. Everything organized and predictable, like a training exercise. But looking at that wall of smoke ahead of us, I had the sinking feeling that the Japanese weren't going to follow our script. The first indication that something was wrong came when we were still 500 yards from shore. That's when the mortars started falling. The initial rounds landed short, sending up towering columns of water that drenched us with warm spray. But the Japanese gunners were walking their fire closer with each salvo, and it was clear they had our range calculated perfectly. These weren't panicked, desperate shots from a beaten enemy. This was precise, methodical fire from positions that had survived 3 days of the heaviest bombardment in Pacific War history. "Keep your heads down," Martinez shouted, but there was nowhere to hide in the open landing craft. We were packed in like sardines, a perfect target for anyone with a mortar tube and decent training. The second salvo bracketed us, with shells exploding on both sides of the boat. Shrapnel whined overhead, and I felt something tug at the sleeve of my dungaree jacket. When I looked down, there was a neat hole torn through the fabric, with blood seeping through underneath. I'd been hit and hadn't even realized it. "You okay, Morrison?" Tommy was pressed against my shoulder, his face pale beneath his helmet. "Just a scratch," I managed, though my voice sounded strange in my own ears. The reality of what we were heading into was starting to sink in. This wasn't going to be a cakewalk. This was going to be a slaughter. The third salvo was right on target. The shell hit the landing craft directly behind us, and the explosion lifted the entire boat out of the water. For a moment, it hung there like a broken toy, and I could see the Marines inside thrown around like rag dolls. Then it crashed back down and began to sink, taking 24 good men with it. Holy Mother of God, someone whispered behind me. But there was no tomato process what we'd just witnessed. Our boat was grinding up onto the coral beach, and the machine guns were opening up from positions we couldn't even see. The bullets came from everywhere and nowhere, cutting through the air with that distinctive crack that meant they were passing close enough to kill. Over the side. Move it! Move it! Martinez was already vaulting over the bow, his rifle held high to keep it dry. I followed, splashing down into knee-deep water that was warm as bathwater and bright red with blood from the Marines who'd landed before us. The coral bottom was sharp as broken glass, and it cut through the thin soles of our boots like they were paper. Booty barely noticed the pain in my feet. All my attention was focused on reaching the cover of what had once been a coconut palm grove, but was now a wasteland of splintered trunks and shell craters. The machine gun fire was so intense that the air itself seemed to shimmer with bullets. I ran as I'd never run before, zigzagging between the stumps of palm trees, leaping over the bodies of Marines who'd landed in the first wave. Some were clearly dead, their helmets blown off and their rifles scattered in the sand. Others were calling for corpsmen, their voices barely audible over the gunfire. Somehow, I made it to the tree line without getting shot, though I couldn't have told you how. Tommy crashed down beside me a second later, gasping for breath, his uniform soaked with seawater and sweat. "Where the hell are they shooting from?" he panted, trying to spot the machine gun positions that were cutting up the beach. That was the question that would haunt us for the next 73 days. The Japanese weren't fighting the way they had on previous islands. Instead of charging us with bayonets and samurai swords, screaming, "Bonsai!" until we cut them down, they disappeared. The entire garrison had gone underground, into a network of caves and tunnels that our bombardment had barely touched. Martinez. Morrison. "Get your asses over here." Our lieutenant, a baby-faced kid from Virginia named Peters, who joined us just before the invasion, was waving us toward what looked like solid rock. As I got closer, I realized it was the entrance to a cave system that had been carefully camouflaged with logs and coral rocks. The Japanese had spent months preparing Peleliu for exactly this kind of assault, and they'd learned from their mistakes on other islands. This time, they were going to make us pay for every yard. "We need to clear that cave complex before we can move inland," Peters shouted over the noise of incoming artillery. "Morrison, Kowalski, Chen, you take the left side. Martinez, Murphy, Jackson, right side. I'll put covering fire on the entrance." It was a standard cave clearing operation, the kind of thing we'd trained for dozens of times. But training and reality are two very different things, especially when the temperature is 115 degrees in the shade and there is no shade. I checked my rifle one more time, made sure I had a grenade ready, and began working my way toward the cave mouth. The coral was sharp enough to cut exposed skin, and it absorbed and reflected heat like a furnace. Within minutes, my uniform was soaked with sweat, and I was having trouble focusing my eyes. That's when the first booby trap went off. Bobby Chin had been moving carefully along a natural depression in the coral, his rifle at the ready, when he stepped on what looked like an ordinary piece of driftwood. The explosion threw him 20 feet backwards, and when the smoke cleared, there wasn't enough left of him to bury. "Booby traps!" Martinez screamed, but we'd already figured that out. The Japanese had wired everything pieces of equipment left behind by the first wave, attractive bits of cover, even the bodies of dead Marines. Every step was potentially lethal, and we were already exhausted from the heat and the strain of the landing. But we were Marines, and Marines don't quit. We kept moving toward that cave, inch by bloody inch, checking every shadow and testing every step. It took us 2 hours to cover 50 yards, and by the time we reached the entrance, half our squad was either dead or wounded. The cave mouth looked like a natural formation, just a crack in the coral rock, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. But as I got closer, I could see the telltale signs of human engineering, chisel marks where the opening had been widened, firing ports cut at precise angles, ventilation shafts that disappeared into darkness. "You ready for this?" Tommy whispered, his face streaked with coral dust and sweat. I nodded, though I wasn't ready for anything. None of us were ready for what we found inside that cave. The Japanese had turned Peleliu's coral ridge into something out of a nightmare. What we found when we finally fought our way into that first cave complex was beyond anything our training had prepared us for. The Japanese had been digging for months, maybe years, creating a three-dimensional maze of tunnels, chambers, and firing positions that turned every advance into a deadly puzzle. The entrance tunnel sloped sharply downward, just wide enough for a man to crawl through on hands and knees. The coral had been carved with hand tools into smooth walls that curved and twisted like the inside of a seashell. Every few feet, there were small chambers cut into the sides, perfect spots for a defender to wait with a rifle or a grenade. I went first, my rifle extended ahead of me, trying to peer into the absolute darkness. The air was thick and humid, with a smell I couldn't identify at first. Only later did I realize it was the stench of death of Japanese soldiers who'd been sealed into positions they'd never expected to leave alive. Contact front. The muzzle flash lit up the tunnel like lightning, and I saw a Japanese soldier crouched in an alcove not 10 feet ahead. He was small and thin, wearing a uniform that looked like it had been buried for months, and his eyes held the fanatical gleam of Alman who'd already made peace with dying. I fired 3 rounds as fast as I could work the bolt, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullets sparked off the coral walls, and I heard the distinctive thunk of at least one round finding its target. The Japanese soldier crumpled without a sound, but that was just the beginning. As we worked our way deeper into the complex, we discovered that the caves weren't just hiding places, they were a complete underground fortress. The Japanese had connected natural coral caverns with hand-carved tunnels, creating antwork that stretched for hundreds of yards beneath the ridge. They had sleeping quarters, ammunition storage, medical stations, even underground cisterns for fresh water. And they had us exactly where they wanted us. Tommy whispered as we entered a chamber the size of a small room. "Look at this place." The walls were lined with weapons racks holding rifles, machine guns, and mortars. Boxes of ammunition were stacked to the ceiling, along with crates of grenades and explosive charges. But what really caught my attention were the maps spread out on a crude table in the center of the room. They showed every inch of Peleliu in precise detail, with our landing beaches marked, our likely approach routes calculated, and firing positions plotted to create interlocking fields of death. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had spent months studying American tactics and preparing the perfect trap. They knew exactly how we'd attack, I said, studying the careful notations in Japanese characters. They've been planning this for months. Martinez nodded grimly, and we walked right into it. The sound of gunfire from deeper in the cave complex reminded us that we weren't alone down here. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, other Japanese soldiers were waiting, probably listening to our every move and preparing their own welcome. We cleared the cave room by room, chamber by chamber, in a deadly game of three-dimensional chess. Every corner could hide an enemy soldier. Every shadow might conceal a booby trap. The Japanese had perfected the art of defense, turning their coral fortress into a killing machine that chewed up American lives at an appalling rate. By the time we fought our way through that first cave system, 6 hours had passed, and what was left of our squad looked like survivors of a train wreck. We were covered in coral dust, blood, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from constant terror. Tommy had taken shrapnel in his left arm from a grenade trap. Big Jim Murphy was nursing a bullet wound in his thigh that he claimed didn't hurt, but was bleeding through his first aid bandage. And we'd advanced exactly 200 yards from the beach. How many more of these things are there? Peters asked, staring up at the ridge that loomed above us like a coral mountain. Martinez consulted the map we'd captured from the Japanese command post. His face was grim as he traced the elevation lines with his finger. Looks like the whole ridge is honeycombed with caves. Could be hundreds of them, all-connected, all covering each other's blind spots. I did some quick math in my head. If it took us 6 hours to clear one small cave complex, and there were hundreds more just like it, we were looking at months of fighting. The 3-day operation our commanders had promised was turning into something much longer and much deadlier. But Marines don't quit, and we didn't have a choice. Peleliu's airfield was crucial for supporting the planned invasion of the Philippines. General MacArthur needed that runway, and it was our job to take it for him, no matter what the cost. As the sun began to set on our first day, casting long shadows across the coral wasteland, I took a moment to look back at the beach where we landed that morning. The white sand was now churned into a muddy mess of blood, equipment, and bodies. Landing craft continued to grind ashore, bringing fresh reinforcements and supplies, but I could see they were taking heavy casualties from the Japanese positions that still commanded the entire shoreline. The smell of death was starting to settle over everything, mixing with the acrid smoke from burning equipment and the cloying sweetness of the tropical flowers that somehow still bloomed in this hellscape. It was a smell I'd never forget, one that would wake me up in cold sweats for decades to come. Morrison. Peters was calling for me. We're moving out. Battalion wants us to probe the next ridge before dark. I shouldered my rifle and checked my ammunition. 18 rounds left in my N-block clip, plus 2 more clips in my belt. 2 grenades, a half-empty canteen of water that tasted like iodine, and a growing certainty that we were in for the fight of our lives. Behind us, the battle for the beach continued to rage. Machine gun fire chattered constantly, punctuated by the crash of mortar rounds and the screams of wounded Marines calling for corpsmen. The Japanese had turned Peleliu into a perfectly orchestrated symphony of death, and we were the unwilling dancers. But as I followed my squad toward the next coral ridge, I felt something I hadn't expected, a grim kind of pride. We were Marines, and this was what we did. We took ground that nobody else could take, at a price nobody else was willing to pay. The Japanese might have prepared the perfect defense, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd chosen to fight the United States Marine Corps. By the 3rd day, the heat had become our worst enemy. The temperature soared past 120 degrees, and the coral rock absorbed and radiated that heat like the inside of a furnace. Men were dropping from heat exhaustion faster than they were falling to Japanese bullets, and our water supplies were running dangerously low. I'd seen combat before, but nothing had prepared me for this. On Guadalcanal, at least you had jungle shade and streams of fresh water. On Tarawa, the fighting was so intense it was over in 3 days. But Peleliu was different. Peleliu was designed to kill us slowly, to wear us down 1 degree at a time until we were too exhausted to fight effectively. Morrison, you look like hell, Tommy said as we took cover behind a demolished Japanese pillbox. His face was sunburned and peeling, his lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. You're not exactly a beauty queen yourself, I croaked back. My voice had turned into a rasp from breathing coral dust and shouting orders over the constant gunfire. The Japanese had timed their defense perfectly. They knew that American forces were used to quick, decisive victories. They knew we'd expect to overrun their positions in a matter of days, then move on to the next objective. Instead, they'd created a meat grinder that would keep us pinned down for weeks, bleeding us white while their real forces prepared for the defense of the Philippines. And it was working. Our battalion had landed with 1,200 Marines 3 days ago. Now we were down to fewer than 800 effectives, and the numbers were dropping every hour. The aid stations were overflowing with heat casualties, men whose bodies had simply shut down under the brutal combination of temperature, stress, and constant combat. But the worst part wasn't the heat or the casualties. The worst part was the gradual realization that the Japanese weren't fighting to win Peleliu. They were fighting to destroy us, even if it meant destroying themselves in the process. Contact left. Martinez's voice cut through my thoughts as muzzle flashes erupted from a cave entrance we thought was sealed. The Japanese had a talent for appearing where they weren't supposed to be, emerging from tunnels and spider holes that connected their positions in ways our intelligence had never imagined. I rolled behind the nearest cover, the twisted remains of a palm tree, and tried to locate the source of the fire. The shots seemed to be coming from solid rock, until I realized that what looked like natural coral formations were actually carefully camouflaged firing positions. Grenade! I pulled the pin and counted off the seconds. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, before hurling it toward the muzzle flashes. The explosion echoed off the coral walls like thunder, but when the smoke cleared, the firing resumed from a different position. They'd moved. Through tunnels we couldn't see, to backup positions we didn't know existed. It was like fighting ghosts who could walk through walls. This was Colonel Nakagawa's masterpiece, a defense in depth that would have impressed the finest military engineers in history. He'd studied every American amphibious assault in the Pacific, learned from every Japanese defeat, and created something entirely new. Instead of trying to throw us back into the sea with a desperate counterattack, he was going to let us come to him, then bleed us to death one cave at a time. "We need to call for artillery support," Peter said, crawling over to our position. Our lieutenant was holding up better than most, but I could see the strain in his eyes. Command had been promising us artillery support for 3 days, but the Japanese observation posts on the ridge made it nearly impossible for our gunners to find targets without hitting our own men. "Good luck with that," Martinez replied grimly. "Every time our guns open up, the Japs spot them from the ridge and drop mortars right on top of them." It was true. The Japanese held the high ground, and they learned to use it with devastating effectiveness. Their observers could see everything we did, while they remained invisibly in their coral fortress. Our commanders were learning the hard way that all the naval bombardment in the world couldn't dislodge an enemy who'd gone underground. But we kept fighting because that's what Marines do. We crawled forward yard by bloody yard, clearing caves with rifle fire and grenades, sealing tunnels with dynamite and flamethrowers, always advancing toward that ridge that seemed to grow taller with each passing hour. The flamethrowers were the worst part. When we found a cave that couldn't be cleared with small arms, we'd call up one of the engineers with a portable flame unit. The sound of those weapons was like a dragon's roar, and the smell of burning fuel mixed with other things I tried not to think about. But they were effective. The Japanese soldiers in the caves faced a choice between burning alive and coming out to face our rifles. Most chose the rifles. They'd emerge from their hiding places with weapons blazing, determined to take as many Marines with them as possible before they died. I respected them for that. They were fighting for their emperor and their homeland, just as we were fighting for America and freedom. But respect didn't make them any less dangerous, and it didn't make our job any easier. On the 4th day, we finally reached the base of the main ridge, the Brogal Massif that dominated the northern end of the island. Looking up at those coral cliffs, I felt a despair deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. The ridge rose nearly 300 feet above us, its sides honeycombed with caves and firing positions that covered every possible approach. "How the hell are we supposed to get up there?" Tommy asked, voicing what we were all thinking. "1 foot at a time," Martinez answered, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Even he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what we were facing. The Japanese had turned Peleliu's coral ridge into the most formidable defensive position in the Pacific. They had artillery observers who could call down accurate fire on any target within miles. They had interlocking fields of machine gun fire that covered every approach route. They had enough food, water, and ammunition stored in their capes to last for months. And they had something else, the absolute conviction that they were fighting the decisive battle of the war. That night, as I tried to sleep in a shell crater filled with coral dust and the lingering smell of death, I thought about home. I pictured Billy getting ready for his senior year, probably dating some girl from the next town over and planning his future without any idea that his big brother was slowly dying on a coral rock in the middle of nowhere. I thought about Mom and Dad, reading my letters and trying to convince themselves that I was safe. The letters I'd been sending home were full of cheerful lies about easy victories and quick advances. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth, that their son was trapped in hell with no way out except through a mountain of coral and Japanese steel. But mostly, I thought about the Marines who died already. Good men like Bobby Chin and dozens of others whose names would be forgotten by everyone except the families who'd never see them again. They died for 6 miles of coral rock and a single airstrip, and I wasn't even sure why it mattered anymore. The Japanese were welcome to Peleliu as far as I was concerned. Let them have their coral fortress and their underground kingdom. Let them sit in their capes until the war ended and the world moved on without them. But I knew we'd keep fighting because that's what we'd been ordered to do. And Marines follow orders, even when those orders lead straight into hell. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the battlefield, I could hear the Japans moving in their tunnels beneath us. They were getting ready for another day of killing, another day of turning American boys into casualties. Somewhere up in those caves, Colonel Nakagawa was planning his next move in the deadly chess game that would determine who controlled this worthless piece of coral. I checked my rifle one more time and prepared to begin another day of the worst fighting I'd ever experienced. The Battle of Peleliu was just getting started. By the end of the first week, we'd learned that Peleliu wasn't one battle. It was hundreds of separate battles, each one fought cape by cape, ridge by ridge, in temperatures that would kill a man just by standing still. The Japanese had divided the island into a series of defensive zones, each one designed to channel our attacks into carefully prepared killing fields. The main ridge system had been given names by our commanders that sounded almost cheerful on the radio: Hill 100, Hill 120, the Five Sisters, Bloody Nose Ridge. But there was nothing cheerful about the reality of fighting for those coral peaks. Each one was a fortress unto itself, connected by tunnels to the others, mutually supporting it, nearly impossible to capture. Morrison, take point, Martinez ordered as we prepared to assault what the maps called Hill 100. It was our 5th attempt to take this particular piece of real estate, and I was starting to think it couldn't be done. I moved forward carefully, testing each step on the razor-sharp coral. The Japanese had perfected the art of camouflage, turning their firing positions into natural-looking rock formations that were invisible until they opened fire. I'd learned to look for the subtle signs: a shadow that was too regular, a piece of coral that reflected light differently, vegetation that grew in unnaturally straight lines. But even with all my experience, I almost missed the spider hole. It was perfectly circular, just large enough for a man's shoulders, cut into the coral and covered with a lid that looked like solid rock. If I hadn't seen the glint of metal from the rifle barrel inside, I would have walked right over it and gotten shot in the back. Instead, I dropped flat and rolled sideways, just as the Japanese soldier inside fired his first shot. The bullet cracked past my ear so close I felt the heat of its passage. Before he could work his bolt for a second shot, I put 3 rounds from my M1 through the opening of his spider hole. Spider hole, 10 o'clock. I called back to the rest of the squad. Probably more of them up ahead. There were more. Lots more. As we worked our way up the slope of Hill 100, we discovered that the entire ridge was riddled with these individual fighting positions, each one manned by a soldier who'd been sealed inside with enough food and ammunition to last for weeks. They had no intention of surrendering, no hope of escape, and nothing to do except kill as many Marines as possible before they died themselves. It was the most personal kind of warfare imaginable. You'd be crawling across the coral, sweating in the 120-degree heat, when suddenly a rifle barrel would emerge from what looked like solid rock not 10 feet away. Sometimes you were faster, sometimes they were. The difference between living and dying came down to split-second reactions and pure luck. Tommy learned that lesson the hard way. We were about halfway up the ridge when he stepped on what looked like a perfectly innocent piece of driftwood. The booby trap that exploded beneath his feet was small, just a grenade wired to a trigger, but it was enough to shred his right leg from the knee down. "Corman! Corman!" I screamed, crawling over to where Tommy had fallen. He was conscious but going into shock, his face pale and sweaty as he stared down at the mess that had been his leg. "Ah, hell, Frank," he whispered. "Looks like I'm not going to make it to that hardware store after all." "Don't talk like that," I said, trying to apply pressure to the worst of the bleeding while watching for enemy fire. "Doc Miller will patch you right up, and you'll be dancing with pretty nurses in Pearl Harbor before you know it." But we both knew better. The corpsman who reached us 5 minutes later took one look at Tommy's leg and started preparing a morphine syringe. It was the largest dose they carried, the kind they gave to men who weren't going to need to worry about addiction. "Tell my folks I was thinking about them," Tommy said as they loaded him onto a stretcher. "And Frank, kill some of those bastards for me." I never saw him again. Later, I heard he died on the hospital ship 3 hours after leaving the ridge. Another good Marine gone, another family back home that would get a telegram they'd never recover from. But there was no time to grieve. The Japanese were launching a counterattack. They came out of caves we'd already cleared, rising from spider holes we'd missed, emerging from tunnels that connected positions miles apart. For a few terrifying minutes, we were surrounded by enemy soldiers who seemed to materialize out of the coral itself. "Banzai! Banzai!" The traditional Japanese battle cry echoed off the ridge walls as they charged our positions with rifles, bayonets, and samurai swords that glinted in the brutal Pacific sun. But these weren't the wild, disorganized charges we'd seen on other islands. These men were disciplined, coordinated, and fighting with the precision of soldiers who'd rehearsed this exact scenario dozens of times. I emptied my rifle into the closest group, working the bolt as fast as my hands could move, hearing the distinctive ping as the in-block clip ejected and rolling away to reload. Around me, other Marines were doing the same, creating a curtain of fire that should have stopped any attack cold. But the Japanese kept coming. They'd learned from their previous defeats, adapting their tactics to match our firepower. Instead of massing their forces for one big charge, they were attacking in small groups from multiple directions, using the coral terrain to break up our defensive fires. "Martinez is down," someone screamed, and I saw our squad leader sprawled motionless behind a chunk of coral that had been his cover. A Japanese soldier with a bayonet was standing over him, preparing to finish the job. I don't remember making the decision to charge. 1 second, I was reloading my rifle, and the next I was sprinting across 20 yards of open ground with my bayonet extended, screaming like a madman. The Japanese soldier turned to face me, his own blade coming up in a perfect textbook thrust that would have gutted me like a fish. But I was bigger, younger, and driven by a rage that had been building for 8 days of watching good Marines die for every yard of coral. My bayonet caught him in the chest, and we went down together in a tangle of weapons and blood. When I rolled away from his body, Martinez was trying to sit up, one hand pressed to a bleeding gash on his forehead. "Thought you were dead, Sarge," I said, helping him to his feet. "Takes more than a with a pig sticker to kill this old Marine," he replied, but I could see he was shaken. We all were. The Japanese counterattack had come closer to breaking our line than any of us wanted to admit. As the sun reached its brutal peak, turning the coral ridges into a furnace that could cook a man alive, We finally secured Hill 100. The cost had been horrific. Our company was down to less than half strength, and the aid stations were overflowing with casualties. But we held the ground, and that meant we could bring up mortars and machine guns to support the next assault. Looking back down the slope we'd just climbed, I could see the entire history of the battle laid out in coral dust and blood. Every boulder, every depression, every piece of cover was marked with the evidence of fighting: spent shell casings, bloody bandages, abandoned equipment, and the small wooden crosses that marked where Marines had fallen too far forward to recover. "How many more hills like this one?" I asked Peters, who was studying his map with the kind of desperate concentration that meant he was trying not to think about the casualties. "Depends on how you count them," he replied. "Could be 5, could be 50. The Japanese have turned this whole ridge into one big fortress." I did math in my head. If Hill 100 had cost us 50 Marines killed and wounded, and there were dozens more hills just like it, we were looking at casualties that would make the bloodiest battles of the war look like training exercises. The Japanese had found the perfect formula for destroying American forces: make us pay for every yard with blood, then make us pay again to hold what we'd taken. But Marines don't quit, and the next morning we were climbing again. By the second week, we'd learned that there was only one weapon that could consistently clear the Japanese cave systems of fire. The portable flame units carried by our engineers became the most valuable pieces of equipment on Peleliu, more precious than artillery and more effective than airstrikes. I was there when Corporal Jake Wilson, a kid from Montana who joined us as a replacement after Guam, made the approach that finally cracked the main Japanese position on what we'd started calling Death Valley Ridge. It was a move that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life, but it was also one of the bravest things I ever witnessed. The cave complex was built into a natural amphitheater in the coral, with firing positions that commanded every possible approach route. 3 companies had tried to take it over Thepest 4 days, and each assault had been cut to pieces before it could get within 100 yards of the entrance. "We're going to need that flamethrower up front," Peters said during the briefing. "Everything else has bounced off this position like spitballs." Wilson nodded and checked his equipment one more time. The portable flame unit weighed 60 pounds and made him a priority target for every Japanese soldier within rifle range. Worse, the fuel tanks on his back were essentially bombs waiting to explode if they took a direct hit. "I'll need covering fire," he said quietly. "Lots of it." We gave him everything we had. As Wilson began his approach, every Marine in the company opened up on the cave entrance, pouring rifle fire and machine gun bullets into every shadow that might conceal an enemy position. The noise was deafening, and the coral dust kicked up by our fire created a screen that might give him some concealment. But the Japanese weren't fooled. They'd seen flamethrowers before, and they knew exactly how dangerous Wilson was to their position. As he got within 50 yards of the cave mouth, concentrated fire began pouring down from positions we couldn't even see. "Wilson's hit!" Someone screamed, and I saw the young Marine stumble and nearly fall. Blood was streaming down his left arm, but he kept moving forward, the flamethrower ready in his hands. At 30 yards, a sniper's bullet punched through his helmet, spinning him around and sending him to his knees. But Wilson wasn't finished. Even wounded, even knowing he was probably going to die, he crawled the last 20 yards to the cave entrance on his hands and knees. When he triggered that flamethrower, the sound was like the roar of a dragon from hell itself. A stream of burning napalm shot into the cave entrance, and the screaming that came from inside was the most terrible sound I'd ever heard. It was the sound of men burning alive, trapped in a coral tomb with no escape except death. Wilson held the trigger down for 30 seconds, painting the inside of that cave with liquid fire, before a Japanese soldier who'd somehow survived the flames put a rifle bullet through his chest. He died still holding the flamethrower, his mission accomplished. When the flames finally died down, we found 17 Japanese soldiers in that cave complex. They'd been armed with enough weapons and ammunition to hold off a regiment, positioned in carefully constructed firing ports that covered every approach. Without Wilson's sacrifice, we would have spent days trying to dig them out, losing dozens more Marines in the process. But Jake Wilson from Montana had ended it in 30 seconds, at the cost of his own life. That night, as I tried to sleep in a foxhole carved into the coral, I thought about Wilson and all the other Marines who died taking these worthless hills. What would their families think if they could see Peleliu? Would they understand why their sons had to die for 6 miles of coral rock and a single airstrip? I was starting to doubt it myself. The strategic importance of Peleliu was becoming less clear with each passing day. The Japanese weren't using the airfield for major operations. Their main forces were already committed to defending the Philippines. We were fighting and dying for a piece of real estate that might not even matter in the larger scope of the war. But orders were orders, and Marines followed orders, even when those orders led into hell itself. By the 3rd week of October, both sides were exhausted. Our division had been fighting continuously for over a month, taking casualties that exceeded anything we'd experienced in the Pacific War. The Japanese garrison, sealed in their coral fortress and cut off from resupply, were running low on food, water, and ammunition. But they weren't running low on determination. Colonel Nakagawa had turned the defense of Peleliu into a masterclass in military engineering and tactical patience. Instead of wasting his men in futile banzai charges, he'd made us come to him, leading us white on every ridge and in every cave. His message to Tokyo had been prophetic. We will fight the Americans for every grain of sand on this island. He'd kept his promise. The final Japanese stronghold was a coral mountain that rose 300 feet above the island, honeycombed with caves and connected by tunnels that had taken months to carve. Our intelligence estimated that over 1,000 enemy soldiers were still alive inside that fortress, with enough supplies to hold out for weeks. "We're going to finish this," Peters announced during our final briefing. He'd been promoted to captain after his predecessor was killed by a sniper, and the responsibility was wearing on him like a 100-pound pack. 3rd Battalion will assault from the north, 2nd Battalion from the south. We'll squeeze them like a vice until they crack. But the Japanese had one final surprise waiting for us. As we began our approach to the base of the main ridge, mortars began falling with an accuracy that seemed impossible. Every shell landed exactly where it would do the most damage, cutting our assault lines to pieces before we could reach the coral slopes. How are they getting such perfect fire? Martinez wondered aloud as we pressed ourselves into whatever cover we could find. The answer came when one of our patrols discovered the Japanese observation post, a carefully camouflaged position on the highest peak of the ridge, with a perfect view of the entire battlefield. The enemy spotters had been watching our every move for weeks, calling down fire that turned each assault into a carefully orchestrated massacre. "We need to take out that observation post," Peters said, studying the peak through his binoculars. "But it's going to take a direct assault up the face of that cliff." It was a suicide mission, and we all knew it. The approach was completely exposed, with no cover except coral outcroppings that offered minimal protection from rifle fire. The Japanese had machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible route. But it had to be done. I volunteered, along with Big Jim Murphy and a replacement named Davis who joined us just 3 days earlier. We were the best climbers in what was left of the company, and somebody had to make the attempt. The climb began at dawn, when the coral was still cool enough to touch without burning your hands. We moved one at a time, testing each handhold, checking every shadow for hidden enemy positions. The Japanese let us get halfway up the cliff face before they opened fire. Davis died first, a sniper's bullet punching through his helmet and sending him tumbling back down the cliff. Murphy made it another 20 feet before machine gun fire from a concealed position cut him nearly in half. That left me alone on a coral cliff face, 300 feet above the ground, with Japanese soldiers shooting at me from positions I couldn't see. It was the most terrified I'd ever been in my life, but I kept climbing because there was nothing else to do. Going back down would have meant certain death, and staying put would have accomplished nothing except getting myself killed more slowly. Somehow, I reached the observation post. The Japanese soldier inside was so focused on directing mortar fire against our assault force that he didn't see me coming until I was close enough to touch the barrel of his rifle with my bayonet. We fought hand to hand on a ledge barely wide enough for one man, 300 feet above the coral rocks below. He was skilled with his rifle and bayonet, but I was bigger and driven by 3 weeks of watching my friends die. When it was over, he fell off the ledge, and I was alone in the Japanese observation post. The view from up there was incredible and terrible. I could see the entire island laid out below me, the beaches where we'd landed, the ridge we'd captured at such terrible cost, the coral valleys where so many Marines had died. I could also see the Japanese positions that were still fighting, the caves that still held enemy soldiers, the tunnels that connected their underground fortress. But most importantly, I could see the radio that controlled their mortar fire. I'd learned enough about Japanese equipment to figure out how to work their communications gear. For the next hour, I fed false coordinates to the enemy mortar crews, directing their fire away from our assault forces and onto empty patches of coral. Without accurate artillery support, the Japanese defense began to crumble. By sunset, the last organized resistance on Peleliu had been eliminated. Colonel Nakagawa and his remaining officers committed ritual suicide in a cave that became their tomb. The Japanese garrison that had fought so brilliantly and died so bravely was finally defeated. But the victory felt hollow. Looking out over the battlefield from my perch on the observation post, I could see the true cost of what we'd accomplished. The coral ridges were littered with the bodies of Marines who died for this worthless piece of rock. Good men like Tommy Kowalski and Jake Wilson and Bobby Chan, whose names would be forgotten by everyone except their families and the Marines who'd served with them. We'd been told the operation would take 3 days. It had taken 74 days and cost us over 10,000 casualties. The Japanese had fought with a skill and determination that commanded respect, even from the Marines who'd been trying to kill them. They'd turned Peleliu into a preview of what the invasion of Japan itself would cost, a glimpse into a hell that might consume both our nations. But we'd won. The American flag flew over Peleliu's airfield, and the strategic objective had been achieved. Whether that victory was worth the price we'd paid was a question I'd spend the rest of my life trying to answer. The transport ship USS Hollandia pulled away from Peleliu on November 15, 1944, carrying what was left of the 1st Marine Division back to Pavuvu for rest and refit. I stood at the stern rail, watching that coral hell shrink into the distance, trying to make sense of what we'd endured. Of the 24 Marines who'd been in my landing craft on September 15th, only 8 were making the return trip. The others were buried in the coral soil of Peleliu or in the military cemetery on Guadalcanal, their bodies too shattered to survive even the best medical care the Navy could provide. Tommy Kowalski had died of his wounds 3 hours after leaving the island. Big Jim Murphy had been killed by a sniper 2 days before the fighting ended. Bobby Chin had been blown apart by a booby trap on our second day ashore. The list went on, each name representing a family back home that would never be whole again. But we'd accomplished our mission. Peleliu's airfield was in American hands, ready to support the planned invasion of the Philippines. The Japanese garrison that had defended it so brilliantly was dead, their coral fortress finally conquered after the longest and costliest battle in Marine Corps history. Whether it had been worth the price was a question that would haunt me for decades. I thought about the Japanese soldiers we'd fought, men like Colonel Nakagawa, who turned a worthless piece of coral into a fortress that had nearly destroyed an entire American division. They'd fought with a skill and courage that commanded respect, even from the Marines who'd spent 2.5 months trying to kill them. But they'd also shown us something that chilled me to the bone. They demonstrated that the Japanese military was learning from their defeats, adapting their tactics, preparing for battles that would make Peleliu look like a training exercise. If this was what it cost to take 6 milis off Coral, what would it cost to invade the Japanese home islands? The answer was too terrible to contemplate. As the Hollandia sailed toward the rest areas of the South Pacific, I tried to write a letter to my parents. How do you explain to people who've never heard a shot fired in anger what it means to watch your best friend die from a booby trap? How do you describe the sound of a flamethrower clearing a cave full of enemy soldiers? How do you make them understand why their son has aged 10 years in 2.5 months? In the end, I wrote the same kind of cheerful lie I'd been sending home since Guadalcanal. I told them I was safe, that the fighting had been easier than expected, that I'd be home soon to help run the family hardware store. I told them everything except the truth, that their son had become a killer, that he'd watched good men die for reasons he no longer understood, that he'd never again be the boy who'd left Ohio full of patriotic dreams. But maybe that was for the best. Maybe some truths are too heavy for civilians to carry. Years later, historians would debate whether the Battle of Peleliu had been necessary. Some would argue that the island's airfield was never crucial to the success of MacArthur's Philippine campaign. Others would contend that the lessons learned on Peleliu ridges helped save American lives during the invasion of Okinawa. All I know is that 1,794 Marines died on Peleliu, and another 8,010 were wounded. The Japanese garrison of 10,900 men was virtually wiped out, with only 202 prisoners taken, most of them Korean laborers who'd been pressed into service. It was a battle that demonstrated both the incredible courage of American Marines and the fanatical determination of Japanese defenders. But it was also a preview of what the invasion of Japan would cost. The Japanese had learned to fight defensively, turning every island into a fortress, making us pay for every yard with blood. If Peleliu was any indication, the final assault on the Japanese home islands would consume both nations in a holocaust of unprecedented proportions. Fortunately, we never had to find out. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war to an abrupt end, sparing both American and Japanese forces the carnage that would have resulted from Operation Downfall. But for those of us who'd fought on Peleliu's coral ridges, the war never really ended. We carried it with us in nightmares that lasted decades, in the faces of friends who died too young, in the knowledge that we'd seen the worst that human beings could do to each other. I went home to Ohio in the spring of 1945, hung up my uniform, and tried to return to civilian life. I married my high school sweetheart, took over the family hardware store, raised 3 children, and lived what most people would consider a normal life. But I never forgot Peleliu. I never forgot Tommy Kowalski's last words, or the sound of Jake Wilson's flamethrower, or the sight of Bobby Chin's body after the booby trap exploded. They were with me every day, reminding me of the price that freedom demands and the courage of ordinary men who rise to meet extraordinary challenges. The Battle of Peleliu taught me that war is not glorious or heroic or noble. War is a terrible necessity, a last resort when all other options have failed. But it also taught me that when that necessity arises, there are men who will answer the call, who will climb coral cliffs under enemy fire, who will charge into caves filled with death, who will give everything they have to protect the values and the people they love. That's the real lesson of Peleliu. Not that war is inevitable or that victory comes without cost, but that when civilization itself is threatened, there will always be Marines willing to storm the gates of hell to defend it. And that, I suppose, is why we remember.